In this story, a man in Nevada carries a secret for 23 years. Not his wife, not his kids, not one living soul hears it. Then, in a hospital bed, with the machines counting down his final hours, he finally says it out loud. And in this account, the strangest part isn't what he says. It's that saying it seems to bring him relief, like a man setting down something heavy he's been carrying alone in the dark. This is the story of Daniel Ashworth. This is the story of what the account says found him on a desert highway. And this is a story about the difference between what we can prove and what we're simply told. In this fictional account, Daniel Ashworth is 34 years old in the fall of 1961, working nights as a propulsion systems engineer for a defense contractor in the deserts of southern Nevada. The story goes that his job involved calibration work on experimental radar equipment. The kind of role, the account says, where you sign paperwork before anyone tells you what the project is actually for, and where the men around you learn not to ask twice. According to the story, Daniel's world at that point is small and orderly. He rents a single room above a laundromat in town. He eats the same breakfast every morning at the same diner counter. His coworkers, in the narrative, describe him as steady. The kind of man who checks his instruments twice, who never signs off on a reading he hasn't personally verified. That steadiness matters later, because it's part of what makes his account, within this fictional story, so hard for his own family to simply dismiss. On the night of October 3rd, 1961, in the account, Daniel finishes a late shift and starts the long drive home along a lonely two-lane desert highway. The narrative describes the drive as routine. He'd made it 100 times before, radio off, windows cracked against the heat, still radiating off the asphalt. Somewhere along that stretch, his truck dies. Not sputters, not rolls to a stop. Dies, all at once, as though something switched it off from the outside. Engine, headlights, the dashboard needle dropping dead mid-arc. Decades later, Daniel is said to have described what happened next to his daughter, Carol, in careful engineer's language. He said the silence afterward wasn't ordinary. No wind, no insects. Even the truck's own settling ticks, the sounds metal makes as it cools, seem to stop. And then, above and slightly ahead of the truck, a light appeared. A light that, in his account, didn't behave the way light should. He remembered looking at his own hands on the steering wheel and noticing that neither hand cast a shadow onto the other, no matter which way he turned them. It's a small, oddly technical detail. And it's part of why this fictional account has such a specific texture. Whether or not the underlying events are real, the story is built around the kind of detail a person tends to remember rather than invent. Not the size of the light, not its color, but the absence it created around it. In the account, Daniel says he stepped out of the truck without deciding to, his legs simply carrying him forward onto the warm asphalt. Standing in the empty road, he describes two small figures, roughly 4 feet tall, large-headed, with dark, patient eyes that didn't blink the way human eyes do. No sound passed between them, he says, and yet something did. An impression, in his words, the way a thumb leaves a print in wet clay, arriving whole rather than word by word. He believed the encounter lasted about an hour. But according to the story, when his truck started again on its own and he made it back to his rented room, nearly 4.5 hours were unaccounted for. A gap he would spend the rest of his life quietly trying and failing to close. In the account, Daniel never told a soul what happened that night. Not at first, and not for a long time after. He went to work the following Monday as though nothing had occurred. His coworkers, in the narrative, noticed nothing different, except perhaps that he double-checked his instrument readings a third time instead of twice, a small tick that stayed with him, according to his daughter, for the rest of his career. The story is careful here, not to dramatize him as visibly shaken. If anything, the account describes a man who folded the experience down small enough to carry privately, the way some people carry grief, present in every room, mentioned in none of them. That's the setup. But according to the account, something else happened that same night. something involving a completely different witness in a completely different part of the story that the family says they didn't learn about until decades later. This is where the story expands beyond one man's account into something the narrative treats as a wider pattern. Though it's worth being clear up front, everything in this section is part of the fictional story, not a real historical record. In the narrative, a young radar technician, we'll call him Airman Ray Delgado, is working an overnight board roughly 11 miles from where Daniel's truck stalled. Delgado, in the story, is 20 years old, 2 years into his enlistment, the kind of young serviceman who takes his logbook seriously because his father drilled into him that a man's word is only as good as his paperwork. In the story, Delgado logs an unidentified contact just after midnight, a target that holds still for several minutes. Then, according to the fictional account, accelerates away at a speed his log describes as inconsistent with any known aircraft of the era. The story continues that by the next afternoon, Delgado's superior tells him the entry was equipment malfunction and instructs him, verbally, never in writing, to let it go. Delgado, in the narrative, does exactly that. Not because he believes the explanation, but because a 20-year-old airman doesn't have much room to argue with a superior officer. In this fictional telling, Delgado never speaks about it publicly again, though the story imagines a private letter discovered by his family long after his death, containing a single line that his sister kept folded in her jewelry box for the rest of her own life. "I know what I saw on that scope, and I know what they told me I saw. Those aren't the same thing." The narrative adds a second character that same week. A fictional intercept pilot, Captain Lena Marsh, scrambled after a separate report matching Delgado's account. In the story, she's one of only a handful of women flying that kind of sortie in 1961, and the account describes her as meticulous almost to a fault, the type of pilot other pilots trusted to file an honest debrief. Her flight log survives, within the fiction, only in fragments, with one word left legible beneath what the narrative imagines as a redaction, visual. The story has her quietly reassigned within weeks, moved to a desk posting far from any runway, and she leaves the service without ever discussing that night again. Not with her husband, not with her children, not even, according to the story, in the private journal she otherwise kept faithfully for 40 years. None of this is presented as real evidence. It's the shape the fictional story takes to dramatize how, in stories like this one, official explanations tend to arrive quickly and neatly, whether or not they hold up to a second look. In the account, by sunrise, every version of that night that didn't match the official explanation had quietly gone quiet, and the only people left holding pieces of it were scattered, reassigned, and told, one way or another, to keep it to themselves. The story adds 3 more characters whose accounts, within the fiction, seem to circle the same night from different angles, each one adding a little more weight to a pattern none of them could see completely on their own. The first, in the narrative, is a gas station attendant. Call him Otis Klein, who remembers watching a silent light drift low over the desert that same night from behind his station's front window. It didn't make a sound, the story has him say decades later to a local folklore archivist. Out there, you can hear a coyote 3 ridges over. That silence is what stayed with me longer than the light did. In the account, Klein never sought anyone out to tell this story. It only surfaced because someone else asked. The second is a rancher, Wendell Cobb, who in the story discovers a scorched circular patch of earth on his land later that same month, roughly 40 feet across, the surrounding brush bent outward as though, in his words in the account, something had sat down there real gentle and gotten back up the same way. A county inspector in the story examines it and writes only 2 words on his closing report, cause undetermined. The third comes from within Daniel's own fictional family. His son Michael, who as a boy of 11 is said to have found his father sitting alone at the kitchen table at night, eyes open, completely still, for nearly 20 minutes. When Michael asks what he's doing, Daniel says only, listening, nothing more. In the story, Michael never asks again, though he says he never forgot the stillness on his father's face. The story then introduces a 4th character, a former contractor named Harold Pruitt, who in the narrative claims decades later that he has documents tying all of this together and arranges to appear on a local television program to say so. In the story, he never makes it to the interview. His car goes off a desert road 2 nights before he's scheduled to appear. And whatever he was planning to bring is never found, leaving the family, within the fiction, with one more loose thread they can never quite pull all the way through. In the narrative, David spends a weekend driving out to Pruitt's last known address, a small rented house on the edge of Tonopah, hoping to speak with whoever might have inherited his belongings. He finds the house occupied by new tenants who know nothing about the previous owner, and a property manager who says the contents were cleared out and disposed of years earlier. Standard procedure after an estate goes unclaimed. It's a dead end presented, within the fiction, exactly as a dead end. Not a revelation, just one more door that turned out to be a wall. It's important to be direct here. Nothing in this section is real documentation. It's the fictional evidence the story constructs to give its mystery shape. And the account itself never claims otherwise. In the narrative, Daniel's son David spends years going through what his father left behind, including several hand-built electronic components stored for decades in a locked garage cabinet. Components no one in the family can identify. The story has a fictional engineering professor examine photographs of them and say only that the configuration doesn't match anything he recognizes from that period or since. Deliberately inconclusive, by design, a dead end dressed up as a clue. The story then imagines a records request turning up an internal memo dated 2 weeks after the October incident, referencing something called Project Quiet Anchor, a name with no further explanation attached anywhere in the surviving pages, closing on a fictional line that David reads over and over, "Subject flagged for continued monitoring, non-invasive, per Directive 12. Subject. Not employee. Not engineer." The word choice, within the story, is what unsettles David most. A second imagined document. A radar summary connecting Delgado's and Marsh's accounts under one case reference. Carries, in the story, a stamped classification borrowed from decades of UFO folklore rather than from any confirmed record, Majestic 12. The story doesn't ask viewers to believe that stamp is authentic. It uses it the way genre fiction has used that name for half a century, as a piece of shared cultural shorthand rather than a claim of fact. Within the fiction, that stamp becomes the moment the story's family stops believing this was ever about one strange night on one highway, and starts wondering, without ever fully answering it, how large the pattern really is. Here, the story reaches for its biggest turn. And again, this is the narrative's own internal logic, not a claim about anything real. In his final hours, the account has Daniel describe more than just the 2 figures on the highway. He describes what he says was shown to him in fragments across more than 2 decades of quiet contact. That the beings, which he calls the Kinfolk, seem to experience time not as a line but as something adjacent. Moments existing beside each other rather than before and after, a way of being he never found better language for than the single word he kept repeating, adjacency. He tells his daughter he doesn't think he was found by accident. He believes, in the story, that his own work, the frequencies, the experimental receivers, made him detectable to whatever was out there, the way a lit window is detectable from a dark field. And this is where the fictional story adds its twist. The imagined Project Quiet Anchor memo wasn't written by anyone claiming contact with anything non-human at all. In the narrative, it was a classified human signals monitoring effort, one that, within the fiction, appears to have been watching Daniel for reasons that overlap suspiciously with whatever else may have been watching him. 2 separate, unrelated interests, both drawn to the same ordinary man on the same ordinary stretch of highway. 2 different kinds of watchers in a story that never confirms either one. Just a man in the desert who, within this narrative, seems to have mattered to somebody, for reasons the account never fully explains and never claims to. The story lingers on Carol's reaction to this part of her father's confession longer than almost any other moment. She's said to have asked him directly whether he was afraid, and the account has him pause a long time before answering, finally saying only that fear was the wrong word for it, that after enough years, what he'd felt had settled into something closer to responsibility, The sense of having been handed a small, permanent duty he never fully understood but never stopped carrying out. Whether that duty was real or simply the shape his mind gave to an unexplainable night, the story leaves entirely open. To be clear, this is a work of fiction. There is no real Daniel Ashworth, no real Airman Delgado, no real Project Quiet Anchor, and no verified radar contact tied to this story. The real locations mentioned, the Nevada desert, a highway, an airbase, are used only to set a mood, not to claim a real incident happened there. What the story is really about is a familiar and very human shape. A person carrying something alone for decades, a family piecing together fragments after the fact, and the impossible to verify space between this really happened and this is the story someone needed to tell. Within the fiction, David never finishes his search. He grows old, still holding a file that runs to several hundred pages and proves nothing conclusively, still wondering whether his father was chosen or simply unlucky enough to be noticed. That unresolved ending is deliberate. The story was never built to hand you an answer, only to hand you the shape of a question and let you sit with it the way Daniel apparently did at his own kitchen table for 23 years. If a story like this makes you wonder how many real accounts get dismissed too quickly, or how many real questions never get real answers, that tension is part of why this kind of storytelling resonates, whether or not any single account in it checks out. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe for more mystery storytelling every week. And down in the comments, I'd love to know. What do you think would actually convince you a story like this was true?